Listen, if savoring drive-in burgers and fizzy drinks is a felony, well, color us guilty as charged. In the 60s, drive-in diners took America by storm, and honestly, who wouldn't be hooked? Let's rewind to the early days of the 60s to find out what fueled the excitement. The 1960s were definitely a great time for a fried chicken bucket. You're really used to only seeing the best of these come from KFC and Wendy's now, but it was actually really common to pull up to a drive-in diner and get a neat bucket. They were first introduced in the 1950s, and it was a pretty straightforward concept for many diners. It really fit convenience food and car culture at the time. Both of those were mixing together, as in more Americans were choosing to get dinners they could eat in their car while moving around. It meant that there was a big focus on portability and convenience when restaurants decided their menus, because they wanted to prove to every customer that, hey, we have the best food around and it's also the easiest to eat. Sounds like a pretty good bottom line for us as eaters, right? It definitely was. Those buckets of the 60s lined with paper going for just $1 or $1.50 were an incredibly affordable and convenient option for people. Working-class families and teenagers in particular loved to get these. Places like California, Georgia, Tennessee, and Texas didn't just have a lot of teens around. They had a lot of car heads, too. It was filled with guys riding the high of their first car that they saved up months for. They were also known for their spicy kick because most buckets used Southern-style seasonings and breadings. In the Midwest, they were a little tamer because people there preferred comfort food, not really a challenge of your spice tolerance. It became a great family meal to have at home or in the car, and diners made twice as many buckets of money for every one bucket of chicken. If you were going for a bucket of chicken, you definitely needed a shake. I mean, come on, it's a no-brainer of a combo, right? The two things you always get a good shake with are burgers and fried chicken. That was true back then too, and there was no better shake than the orange creamsicle. The flavor known as creamsicle was actually made in the 1920s by a company of the same name, and it caught on like a disease with people. Frozen orange and vanilla, who would have thought? If you held a gun to my head and asked me if that would sell hundreds of thousands, then I'd just laugh. By the 1960s, though, it had sold enough that it actually managed to build up nostalgia with its customers. The creamsicle was added to drive-ins throughout the 50s and 60s as an attempt to capitalize on that nostalgia for fans who were there for its birth in the 20s and for teens who were buying loads of chicken buckets. It went great with all kinds of food that was popular with the youth anyway. A bucket, your friends, some shakes and fries, that's a pretty close second to the American dream. Plus, if you got a bucket and the shake to go with it, you were looking at maybe $1.25 or $2.25 in total. The shake itself was for 25 or 75 cents in most places, and it was also extremely popular in hotter areas like Arizona and California. I mean, California wasn't hot enough for fires to erupt randomly back then, but you could still work up a real sweat, and the best way to deal with that summer heat was a frozen creamsicle. So let's say you were in one of those super hot states and you just didn't feel like greasing up your day to hell and back with all those fried fats and oils. Chicken buckets definitely weren't for you, but a frozen shake just wasn't cutting it either. You needed a real dessert, so what would you go for? Let me introduce you to the apple pie a la mode, which actually goes all the way back to the 1900s. The story goes something like this. Apparently, a New York diner once served a customer who combined their ice cream with the pie. This inspired the idea behind apple pie a la mode. It slowly started becoming a niche way of having a pie that slowly exploded in popularity and found itself some real dedicated fans, and by the 1960s, Americans were fully in their bag with all kinds of food experimentation and pairing warm desserts with cold sides. Another big reason why this pie was such a nightmare for its competitors was because it was priced literally the same as one of those creamsicle shakes we just talked about. You get a pie and ice cream to go with it for 75 cents, and it doesn't take a nuclear physicist to figure out how a business model like that goes nationwide. The apple pie was already something deeply rooted in American culture anyway, so this neat little variation only helped cement its legacy further. Also, the idea itself is just genius. Seriously, it's like giving steroids to food. The pie tastes unimaginably better if you just pair it up with some ice cream. And as I said before, it really takes the edge off in states where the temperature gets high. I can't explain why his first name is Tiny, but Tiny Naylor was a Californian restaurateur who made one really important contribution to the cultural zeitgeist of America. That was the patty melt burger, which was one of the first times a sandwich and a hamburger were combined to make a hybrid. It was done in the 40s and 50s, so it wasn't exactly too welcomed at first, because fusion food hadn't taken off much as a concept. When people did start giving it a shot after it appeared in his Los Angeles fast food chains, though, it took over the nation. A patty melt craze was dominating the entirety of the United States. Don't ever underestimate the power a well-seasoned beef patty can hold. Drive-in diners had lines of cars waiting for the divine chance to get their hands on this angelic combination of rye bread, caramelized onions, and Swiss cheese. Sounds simple enough, right? Throughout the Midwest and East Coast, this burger carved a legacy for itself that almost none matched if we talk about the rest of the burgers that were coming out in that time period. It certainly put a Big Mac to shame. Plus, it got really popular with German-American communities because they already were deep believers in rye bread-based burgers. The West Coast, on the other hand, experimented with some other flavors, such as different styles of seasonings, but the patty melt did just as well there too. Diners even used to have Melt Mondays, where a patty melt burger, fries, and shake combo would go on a discount. How can we play the Diner's Greatest Hits album and skip root beer floats? Arguably the most influential track on the whole project, this drink combined the spicy tang of root beer with a very smooth, thick scoop of vanilla ice cream, which led to it becoming one of the most popular items at diners and soda fountains. By the way, here's a bit of an unrelated cultural fact for you. While diner culture was popping off, so were soda fountains as an industry, so root beer floats all in all had every bit of support and momentum. They used that pretty well too. Otherwise, they wouldn't become the cultural phenomena they are today. Frank J. Wisner is the first person we can thank the root beer float for. He was the owner of Cripple Creek Brewing, and apparently he's the one who made the first root beer float. From there on, diners, bars, and ice cream parlors would perfect the technique to make a flawless float. Most agreed on one fundamental rule, which was that you really needed to nail the balance of vanilla ice cream and the root beer. Too much drink would take away from the texture of the ice cream, but too much ice cream would mess with the flavor of the drink. It was also family-friendly because it was just root beer. You could kind of drink with dad and mom that way, which meant that a lot of families used floats at diners as a nice little bonding experience. You know how you go to a Nando's and they have bottomless drinks? Well, some diners did that with floats back then, which made it even more successful. You know, we mentioned burgers, fried chicken, shakes, and even pies, but there's still one more member of the original crew we're missing: onion rings. Just like you can't have a Transformers movie without Bumblebee, you can't get a diner going if you don't know how to make onion rings. The earliest recipe I could find for onion rings was actually from a 1933 New York Times article, which was a pretty basic recipe. The classic onion ring evolved into ditching cornmeal later on, but the 1933 one had a lot of the stuff in the batter. Right after 1933, it didn't really take long for onion rings to become another must-have fast food item if you were going for a main meal like a burger. The thing about fast food is that a lot of it is built around one item. You get a burger or you get fried chicken. Okay, so you obviously need sides and a drink, right? So what if you only have fries? Gets a bit stale eventually. You switch it up with golden crisp onion rings worth barely a meager 25 cents, and whether you're in Texas or California, you can always trust in the quality. Chains like Dairy Queen had some of the best onion rings around, and drive-ins and diners would do promotional meals centered around onion rings, such as combo baskets or side swap Wednesdays, which let customers swap between either fries as a side or onion rings. Deals really go a long way, you know. If you keep on heading towards the Southwest, you'll eventually come across diners with deals for Frito pies. You might wonder what that even is, and that's what I'm here to explain to you. So you see, there was this woman known as Daisy Doolin, whose son made Fritos in the first place. Charles Elmer Doolin had a pretty potent recipe for success when he first stumbled onto how to make a Frito corn chip in the 1930s, but it wasn't until his mom took the chips and beef chili and put it all together in a bowl that the Frito pie was first born. Yeah, I know, false advertising, right? It's not really a pie. But do we care for semantics in the face of such a culinary star? I wouldn't care much for labeling. You could call it a mimosa, and I think I'd still down several bowls of Frito pies in one go, and I know that's a sentiment a lot of Americans out there can share. Eventually, people started adding shredded cheese and chopped onions, olives, jalapenos, sour cream, and all sorts of condiments and toppings to the typical bowl to really give it some variety and flexibility as a dish. It worked too, since while it was already affordable at under $1 at most diners, it was now also really accessible. More than it originally was, you could throw anything into the bowl alongside the beef and Frito chips. Experimentative food really is the best. It's like Russian roulette but with calories. Did you just waste yours? Are you maybe about to strike gold? You'll never know until you get cooking. Sloppy Joes aren't just a catchy buzzword you hear in shows set in retro times, but a real showstopper that's been associated with drive-in diner culture for years and years. Not just that, since we're specifically talking about the 1960s, it was even common for people to find this as a cafeteria item in schools. It erupted most in the 50s and 60s, where there was a lot of demand for easy-to-make casual meals that worked better in social settings or as comfort food. You know, the kind of stuff you can munch on and have a good conversation with your friends at the same time. The reason Sloppy Joes became so popular, not just in drive-in diners but as a food to make at home too, was because they used a lot of convenience ingredients like canned food, which were really cheap and easy to make. You had your sauces in a bottle, some spices if you were making it at home, and everything else in a can. So, what really were you cooking? It was more assembling a meal together than any actual kind of effort. That's what made them work so well for diners too, because production was a cakewalk when it was this easy to make a Sloppy Joe. Fried shrimp baskets were an American drive-in staple, especially in areas of the Midwest and South where there was a large fishing industry. Coastal cities with drive-ins thrived off of these the most, and where lots of people in the East Coast had their fried chicken buckets, a lot of people in the South enjoyed these shrimp ones instead. Shrimp was always a part of seafood tradition in America, as was fishing, so it was a taste that had already settled into the population well enough. Diners and drive-ins throughout the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic never shied away from showing off their shrimp bucket skills, and each had their own promotions like shrimp sundae or price cuts going on. In other words, competition was pretty healthy, and who benefits the most off of that? Foodies like you and me, my good friend. I don't know about you, but I would really like to go back to the days where a fried shrimp bucket was something I could easily afford. I mean, at just $150, that's a pretty big steal. Off the top of my head, though, you could get it even cheaper in some states like Florida and Louisiana. So by the 1960s, there were a lot of things going on in America culturally speaking. There was all this craze surrounding easy food, but there was also a lot of interest in exploring other cuisines and foreign taste palettes. Of course, since it is America, a mix of those two concepts was pretty inevitable. That's how drive-in pizza slices became really popular as a concept. The classic Italian slice was now something you would find at any roadside dinner, or, well, a cheap comfort food version of it. Restaurants like Pizza Hut and Shakey's Pizza also really popularized the idea of drive-in pizza slices. Hey, sometimes you don't feel like getting a whole pie. Sometimes you just wanted to share a few slices, and these were perfect for that. They were also pretty affordable. Most places sold them for around $0.15 to $0.35, and you could get pepperoni slices or even choose your toppings. A lot of people were some pretty die-hard fans of mushrooms, for example, and these even started giving some local pizzerias a headache because of the competition. Back then, you also had public movie setups where you could watch movies on projectors from the comfort of your car. Drive-in culture worked well with activities like that, and pizza slices were a pretty popular demand anyway for most diners. It was about time they got them on the menu, really. Pennsylvania might not have a lot of claims to fame, but this one is undoubtedly something that makes the state a national treasure. I didn't think about it either, but that place is actually responsible for coming up with the banana split. Yes, the banana split. The one we've seen so many times in cartoons. The ones we get commercials for all the time. The ones that you'd always want because it seemed like the dreamiest dessert of them all. Plus, having a banana split for just $1 was something entirely different. There was nothing that this dish didn't do right. It gave us style, flair, presentation, taste, affordability. It filled you up. Seriously, it was like everyone's poster boy for what a drive-in dessert should be. Promotional days for this were always the kind of Sundays where you'd nag your father to the moon and back to take out the car and the family for some banana splits. They had Sunday Sundays and Banana Split Wednesdays with discounted prices, and some parlors started having their own variations of the very popular split. Versions like the Brownie Banana Split became really popular, and when it was really at the peak of its popularity, each state had its own regional style of banana split that it became known for. It's still just as popular today, only 10 times more expensive, so somebody please take us back to better days. Did you know a funny fact about Sunnies? Whether you love chocolate ones or butterscotch ones, we might not have ever had them if not for one petty law. See, in the early 1900s, there was something called blue laws, which basically were like a trial version of prohibition but for sodas. You couldn't buy a soda on Sunday for some reason. I don't know. The logic escapes me too. Maybe you'll figure out why this was there. If you do know the history behind these laws, drop it in the comments. Anyway, apparently, chocolate and butterscotch sundaes originated as a result of these laws because people needed to get their sweet tooth filled somehow. Most sundaes were pretty cheap too, for usually 30 or 45 cents. It was one of the mainstays of the lineups of most ice cream parlors, and daily special discounts also meant that they would continue to be a really popular item. In states like California especially, there was always a strong demand for a chilled sundae. It took that California heat off of your shoulders, you know? And in the Midwest, which had a booming drive-in culture, people loved to take away a sundae or two and have it on a drive. Things like that were fundamental parts of being and growing up in America back then. The best thing about a club sandwich is that you can really make it a stack of anything. I mean, yours could look like tomatoes, lettuce, and turkey, while mine could look like smoked sausage, mushrooms, and caramelized onions. You would call both of these a club sandwich, though. Where did they come from? And more importantly, why are they called club sandwiches? One of the most popular theories is that there was the Union Club in New York City, and that's apparently where the sandwich was first made in the 1880s. Nowadays, we think of it as fast food, just a casual sandwich to grab on your way to work. But back then, the Union Club was above most people's pay grades, and club sandwiches were considered luxury foods. It eventually spread way further than clubs and high-end hotels, though, and became something that you associate with diners and all kinds of fast food joints now. The club sandwiches you'd get in drive-ins weren't the most inspired ones. They didn't have a lot going on, but you could rely on them to fill your appetite. I mean, it was just a sandwich, and not exactly a really flashy one. It's supposed to have 3 layers of toasted white or wheat bread, and the fillings can be turkey, chicken, bacon, or just about anything. If there is one constant, it's probably mayonnaise. I don't think club sandwiches really align with the taste buds of today, but maybe I'm wrong. Do we have any club sandwich lovers watching right now? One of the most iconic things we can talk about as far as drive-in food culture goes are cheeseburgers. They were simple, but they were versatile. A cheeseburger could have been anything, from a beef patty with cheese and tomato to a full-blown burger with mushrooms, pickles, olives, and all sorts of sauces and toppings. It was really what you made of it, and some diners became known for their cheeseburgers especially. A lot of them even had promotions that were centered exclusively around cheeseburgers and offered them at a discount. Plus, they were one of the few items that all age groups could just enjoy without worries. Whether you were a teen or a kid, an adult or a middle-aged man coming home from another shift at the factory, a cheeseburger would lift up anyone's spirits. The best thing to go with your cheeseburger was often a chocolate malt milkshake, and it used to be served in these special metal mixing cups so that it could be kept cold for longer. It was advertised as a special shake, so some diners charged a bit more for it. It was really a big part of the whole drive-in diner aesthetic, though. Neon lights, burgers wrapped in papers, flashing tail lights in cars, the smell of oil and potatoes, chocolate milkshakes frozen just right. It was a big part of fast food culture as a whole. Chocolate milkshakes were arguably some of the most popular shakes to order. The shake was pretty thick too, so it was more common for people to sip it slowly, which made it perfect to go along with your burger. It's funny that this was actually a nutritional supplement made by a chemist known as James Horlick, but when people discovered that adding malt actually makes the milkshake itself taste better, this started popping up in soda fountains and drive-ins throughout the country. How do you get your kid to stop nagging you? It's a serious dilemma, and one that we've all experienced before. Some things are tried and tested, time-worn methods though, and they work just as well now as they did back then. It's comforting to know that even 60 years ago, the way to keep little runts in line was corn dogs. Speaking of lines, there was always a massive one outside drive-ins and diners whenever they would include corn dogs as a part of kids' meal specials, or whenever corn dog nights were happening. You've probably noticed this by now, but diners and restaurants back then were a lot more forgiving with their promotions than they are now. Well, that's fair. They didn't have to pay $1,000 and up in rent for a janky one-bedroom apartment either. Rent prices weren't the only thing that were better off then, though. It was also just a lot easier to offer discounts because supply was pretty cheap. Nowadays, it just costs more to make these same things. That KFC bucket 10 years ago was substantially cheaper, and so were corn dogs. They were festival favorites too, and they became closely associated with just about any definition of joy or happiness that a person could have. Long story short, there wasn't ever an occasion that wasn't better off once it included corn dogs, and there was no occasion where corn dogs weren't a good idea. Isn't it interesting how different things can be from state to state? Detroit, you get corn dogs. New England, you get fried clams. Somebody has to do a study on how that works someday. Anyway, fried clams actually first became pretty popular in Massachusetts. Local seafood shacks first had them as items in the start of the 1900s, and there even used to be clam shacks. One of the most popular ones were the ones that were run by Lawrence "Chubby" Woodman, who reportedly made the first ever fried clams when he served them at Independence Day. The waters of New England have always been loaded with clams anyway, so it's no surprise that it became such a staple there. There's really nothing like some deep-fried clams dipped in tartar sauce to make you appreciate seafood, and when it comes for only $1 or for $2.50 for a whole basket, any argument against fried clams starts to look pretty weak. I don't need to tell any of you about how popular meatloafs are here in the States. Even in the Great Depression, when people couldn't afford them, they came up with low-budget versions and mock meatloafs. Meatloaf sandwiches kind of had their start from ideas like that. A typical meatloaf sandwich had really thick slices of meatloaf that were served with bread and mustard, but some added mashed potatoes and cheese too. There were specials like the blue plate meatloaf sandwich one at a lot of diners, and it was kind of the perfect meal for people who wanted to get a full stomach on a budget. Sometimes diner food can leave you feeling a little bit unfulfilled even if it tastes great, but not enough that you'd consider going for round two. So, meals that fill up the tank in one go become fan favorites really easily. Meatloaf sandwiches are just like that, and it was something you could easily enjoy with your family too. Whether you'd eat it at a drive-in or bring some home for the kids and missus, meatloaf sandwiches are a relic of a much more nostalgic and simpler time in America. Now, grilled cheese sandwiches have been the bag lunches of kids, teens, adults, and everyone in between. There's no person that hasn't coasted on these before, and a lot of people still continue to do so. While the concept of a grilled cheese sandwich isn't really new, they only really took off in America commercially after the Depression. They became one of the most popular things to eat for some people who still didn't suffer the brunt of the Depression but did go through a lot of lifestyle changes. It was there that diners first began to pick up on the notion that there's a pretty decent market for grilled cheese sandwiches. Before, the general consensus was that it was just something people could make at home, not something they'd go out for and spend money on, you know? That changed by the 50s and 60s, And while they weren't the priciest items on the menu or the most eye-catching ones, a grilled cheese sandwich was always the kind of meal that would knock you into a zone of comfort and refreshment, especially with some fries and soda. Some say fast food makes you sluggish, but personally, I'm fueled by it, and there's nothing better for the tank than a grilled cheese sandwich. Not everyone's a dairy fan, though. Actually, some people are unironically lactose intolerant. Okay, I'm sorry, it's a pretty serious issue. What do you do when you can't handle your dairy, though? You get alternatives, and one of the best ones around were tuna salad sandwiches. They also used canned tuna, and as we already discussed, canned food was really making a name for itself. Plus, people liked the fact that tuna salad sandwiches had toppings you wouldn't normally ever expect out of a sandwich back then. The concept of putting things you'd find in a salad on your sandwich was relatively new. In coastal cities where even little kids were firmly used to the taste of tuna, this didn't need a lot of time to get familiar with the population. However, in other places, it was still a bit of a questionable move. Like, it wasn't really a bad meal, but was it the best one? Or even one of the greats? Maybe not. People found it hard to justify a tuna salad sandwich over, let's say, a chicken wing deal or fried nuggets. You get used to fast food, and anything that resembles real nutrition starts to look pretty unfamiliar. But it was cheap enough that people gave it a shot. It just cost $1, right? A lot of them felt lucky that they did, since it tasted great. Potato salad is actually something we can thank the Germans for. Hey, don't look at me. They're the ones that brought it over in the 19th century. I mean, there were still some kinds of offshoot recipes circulating in America during the 17th and 18th centuries, but those were closer to seasoned mashed potatoes than a potato salad. These ones had a vinegar-based dressing, and some even had mayonnaise-based ones. They became a part of diner culture because they went really well along with most other things that diners served. Having a burger? Want a healthy side? Potato salad's your man. Need to wash down that fried chicken with some greens? A good potato salad will have you covered. You get the picture? Plus, it didn't help that they were dirt cheap. I don't know about you, but I personally always love my fast food with a side of potatoes. If you're the same, share your favorite potato salad places down in the comments. I'm really not sure who made coleslaw in the first place, but if we are talking about healthy sides, then there's probably nothing that'll ever beat this one. It has shredded cabbage, carrots, mayo, vinegar, sugar, and some other seasonings. Some diners even used buttermilk and vinegar-based dressings and had different coleslaws so that you could pick and choose what you wanted. It went amazing with the fried stuff, too. I mean, you don't think KFC was the first brand to ever pair coleslaw up with everything deep-fried, right? That's been a thing since forever now. You might be surprised, but one of the coleslaw-heavy states was actually Texas. It's because coleslaw was the perfect option for a barbecue and was often also the perfect side to get at a diner. Sometimes you wanted something nice and light, not just things drenched in oil, and this was the perfect side for that. Barbecue beef sandwiches were just as popular at diners as club sandwiches and burgers. Smoked brisket is quintessentially American, and it's something you'll never be able to separate from the culture. Everyone in Uncle Sam's country loves a good barbecue, and they love a good sandwich even more. You mix the two together to get barbecue beef sandwiches, and you can see why this got so popular. Plus, I don't know anyone even outside of the South who has ever turned down a good barbecue sauce-based dish. Speaking of coleslaw, it also used to double as a topping in some sandwiches and burgers. The barbecue beef sandwich most diners would sell would always have a bit of coleslaw on the top, and all things considered, they were pretty affordable too. I mean, $1.50 for a smoked brisket sandwich in Maine states like Kansas and Texas was a pretty good deal, right? And you could always look forward to barbecue night deals for a discount. Most of the things on this list are probably names you've already heard of. The cherry limeade is special, though. It's something that's really faded out of memory but was all the rage back then in the 60s. It was one of the first fruity-flavored drinks that really broke out into the mainstream, and it was a hit with the younger crowd. Teenagers, especially, didn't have a lot going for them in the non-alcoholic department besides root beers, so when they got cherry limeades, a lot of them latched onto the drink badly. Plus, it just looked really pretty. Garnished with maraschino cherries and lime wedges and mixed with soda, the drink had flavor and style, and it was extremely refreshing to have. Drive-ins would always include it because, sure, the sodas and shakes captured audiences who were desperately into fast food, but cherry limeade was for people who liked sweeter, syrupy drinks with their burgers instead. Some burger heads swear by double patties. They live for the thrill of the game, they want a fatter, bigger burger, and they won't be satisfied until they see what that's like. The club burger was something diners came up with exactly for people like that. The ones that thought the meat patty between two slices of bread format was the pinnacle of food that humans could reach as a species. It was an experimental burger variation, but it was definitely an experiment that stayed in the long run too. Club burgers had bigger patties and were often topped with bacon or fried eggs served on Texas toasted buns. It would also be cut in half and served like a club sandwich, and it was priced higher too. Still though, if you ignore the cholesterol concerns, it was a really good meal. Sometimes when you have a serious burger craving, you need a real Whopper to knock you out and give you that thrill you're looking for. Club burgers did exactly that for a lot of people, and they were still decently priced. Do you understand why diners were the rage back then? I definitely see why people loved them. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed today's roundup.